Bottom of form, who decides which legends survive? History is a graveyard of forgotten truths, and some stories were never meant to see the light. Yet, this one refuses to die. The tale of two brothers, born from a whisper between a god and a mortal, condemned before they could draw breath, thrown to the river like discarded omens, should have been lost to time. But it wasn't. It clawed its way out of the abyss, blood-soaked and unrelenting, demanding to be told. Romulus and Remus. You've heard their names. But what if everything you think you know about them is a lie? What if the story that built the greatest empire in history is not a tale of destiny, but one of deception? A murdered king. A stolen throne. A mother imprisoned in the name of fear. A prophecy so dangerous that it had to be drowned before it could take its first breath. Two infants, marked by the gods, cursed by men, sent floating down a river meant to be their grave. But fate does not bleed easily. A wolf found them. Or so the legend says. But does nature bend so willingly to the needs of men? Was it truly the hands of the wild that raised them, or the hands of those who lurked in the shadows, steering them toward an end they could never escape? Brothers. Rivals. One sword, two hands. A city that could only be built on sacrifice. But whose blood was always meant to stain the foundations? Who decided that Romulus must rise and Remus must fall? And if Rome's first king was chosen by the gods, why did he vanish like a ghost, swallowed by a storm no mortal could witness? This is not a legend. It is a warning. And once you open the gates to this story, they may never close again. The fire burned low, licking at the last remnants of wood, throwing long shadows against the temple walls. The air was thick with the scent of incense and something older, something raw, metallic, like the breath of fate itself. Outside, the wind howled through the streets of Alba Longa, rattling doors, slamming against shutters as if unseen hands clawed at the city, desperate to be heard. Inside, she knelt. Rhea Silvia. Daughter of a fallen king, prisoner of prophecy, priestess by force, mother by something far greater than will. Her hands trembled against the cold stone floor, her pulse a wild drum against the silence. And then, pain. A sharp, twisting force inside her, primal and unstoppable. A scream clawed at her throat, but she swallowed it. This temple had already taken too much from her. It would not take her voice. She doubled over, sweat slick against her skin, as another wave of agony shot through her. This was no ordinary birth. Something ancient stirred in the air, humming beneath her ribs, crackling through her blood. The gods were watching. They had always been watching. The torches flickered violently, throwing the shadows into chaos. And then, a whisper. Low, distant, yet deafening in its meaning. A voice that was not human, nor entirely divine. Words carved from the bones of time itself. Two shall rise. One shall fall. And from blood, a throne of stone will grow. Rhea Silvia gasped, her body arching in pain and revelation. She knew. She had always known. From the moment her uncle forced her into the Vestal Order, sealing her fate in white robes and silence. From the moment Mars came to her in the dead of night, his presence overwhelming, his touch like fire, his voice like war. From the moment she felt them stir inside her, two heartbeats where there should have been none. They were never meant to live. And yet, here they were. The first cry ripped through the temple like a blade through flesh. A wail not of weakness, but of defiance. A voice refusing to be silenced. The second followed, fainter, but steady. The twins. Romulus. Remus. The prophecy was set in motion. The torches flared violently, too violently. A sudden gust of wind howled through the chamber, though there were no open doors. The fire roared higher, golden embers swirling in the air, twisting, forming something, a shape, a symbol. The face of a wolf, its maw wide, its eyes hollow voids that burned like dying stars. Rhea Silvia's breath hitched. This was no ordinary omen. The wolf faded, but the heat lingered. A final whisper ghosted through the room, curling around her like unseen fingers. One shall fall. The door burst open. Guards stormed in, their faces grim, their hands on their swords. They knew. Someone had told them. The gods spoke in riddles, but men only needed one truth: 2 sons had been born where none should have existed. They seized her, tore the infants from her arms. Romulus screamed. Remus whimpered. Rhea Silvia fought, her nails raking flesh, her voice a snarl of rage and desperation. They dragged her to the dungeons. The infants? To the river. And the gods watched, silent, waiting. The wind had died. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. In the great hall of Albulonga, torches burned low, their flames struggling against the silence. Shadows stretched long across the stone floor, flickering, shifting, alive with something unseen. Numita sat at the head of the chamber, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, though he did not yet draw it. His brother stood before him. Amulius. The blood of kings ran through them both, but only one could rule. And Amulius had never been content to stand in the light of another. A single step. Soft, deliberate. Amulius moved closer, his eyes dark pools of something unreadable. His lips barely curled, not quite a smile, not quite a sneer, just the ghost of something that made the air colder. Then came the sound. A single blade sliding from its sheath. Numita tensed. His grip tightened. He had known this moment was coming. He had seen it in the way his brother's hand lingered too long on the throne's armrest. In the way whispers followed him like a plague through the halls. In the way fear had settled over his city, thick and cloying, wrapping around its people like a death shroud. Betrayal is never loud. It seeps in like rot, silent, insidious, until the walls crumble beneath its weight. You should have killed me when you had the chance. Amulius' voice was a razor in the stillness. Numita's jaw clenched. You are my brother. Amulius laughed. A sharp, brittle sound. That is precisely why I will not make the same mistake. The doors behind him burst open. The sound of steel. Footsteps, many, too many. Guards poured in, their faces hard, their loyalty already decided. Numita saw it in their eyes, the way they did not flinch, did not hesitate. It was over. No grand battle. No righteous last stand. Just this, the quiet suffocation of a king in his own halls, his fate sealed by blood thicker than any crown. Amulius stepped closer, lowering his voice. I will not kill you, he murmured, but I will take everything. And he did. Numita was dragged from his throne, his protests drowned in the roar of Amulius' first decree. The crown was torn from his brow, his sword stripped from his grasp. The people of Albulonga would not resist. They had already chosen silence. And as Numita was led into the darkness of the dungeons, his brother stood where he once had, his hand resting on the armrest, not lingering now, but claiming. The throne had a new master. And the gods watched, unblinking. The night reeked of treachery. A hush had fallen over Albulonga, thick as a burial shroud. The torches lining the streets burned low, their flickering light barely holding back the creeping dark. The silence was unnatural, as if the city itself had stopped breathing, as if the earth beneath had gone still in anticipation of something irreversible. Inside the grand hall, Numita sat on the throne, his throne. The weight of his ancestors pressed upon his shoulders, unseen but suffocating. His fingers curled over the cold arms of the chair, gripping it as if it might slip away. He could feel it. The unease, the tension, the unspoken warning in the air. He was not alone. A single step echoed against the marble floor. Slow. Measured. Numita did not turn. He did not need to. He already knew. Amulius. His brother's presence was an iron blade pressing against his spine, cold and inevitable. Numita kept his expression steady, but his heartbeat pounded like war drums in his chest. The silence between them stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring. Then, at last, Amulius spoke. You should have never been king. Numita exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening. "You speak as if the gods made a mistake." A shadow of a smirk played at Amulius' lips. Perhaps they did. There was no anger in his voice, no heat, just certainty. A cruel, unshakable certainty that made Numita's stomach twist. The doors creaked open. The sound sent a ripple of tension through the room. Footsteps. Too many. Numita turned his head slightly, just enough to see them. Armed men. His own guards. Their faces were like stone, devoid of hesitation, of doubt. The air grew heavier. A suffocating weight pressed down on his chest. He rose slowly, deliberately. "Do you know what you're doing?" A whisper of steel. A blade slipping from its sheath. Amulius' smile did not waver. "I am taking what was always meant to be mine." The words were a death sentence. Numita moved before he thought, his instinct screaming. His sword was already in his grip, the weight of it familiar, comforting, too late. The first blow struck hard across his back, sending him to his knees. Another. The guard seized him, ripping the weapon from his grasp, wrenching his arms behind him. Pain lanced through his ribs, his shoulders. He fought, but there were too many. Amulius stepped forward, watching, savoring. "You will not die tonight, brother." His voice was smooth, almost gentle. That would be merciful. Numita struggled, his breath ragged, his fury boiling beneath the pain. Amulius leaned closer, his lips near Numita's ear. "I will take your city. Your crown. And when I am done, you will be nothing more than a ghost, a forgotten whisper in the halls of history." Numita gritted his teeth. "The gods are watching." Amulius chuckled. "Then let them witness the birth of a true king." And with a final nod, the guards dragged Numita away. The throne was empty. Not for long. The air was heavy with the scent of burning oil and cold stone. The torches lining the temple walls flickered, their flames thin and restless, as if they, too, sensed what was coming. The silence was unnatural, pressing against the walls, against the flesh, against the soul. A silence before a sentence. Before a life was stolen. Rhea Silvia stood motionless, her breath shallow, her pulse unsteady. The white fabric of her tunic felt like a shroud wrapped around her body, suffocating, final. She had known fear before, whispers in the dark, shadows slithering along the palace halls, but nothing like this. Nothing like the cold certainty curling around her throat now. She could hear them behind her. Heavy footsteps. The scrape of sandals against stone. The murmur of hushed voices, reverent and cold. The priestesses were waiting. Watching. Ready to receive their newest sister, their latest sacrifice to duty, to purity, to chains dressed as divinity. And then, another set of footsteps. Different. Measured. Weighted with power. Amulius. She did not turn. She did not need to. His presence filled the chamber like a poison, seeping into the cracks of the temple, into her bones. A hand, rough and unyielding, gripped her shoulder. She stiffened. "Your fate is a gift," his voice murmured, smooth as oil, thick with something venomous. "You should be grateful." Grateful. The word burned like iron in her chest. Her father's face flashed before her eyes, Numita, dethroned, betrayed, dragged away like an animal while Amulius took his place. She had not seen him since. She did not even know if he was still alive. And now, Amulius had come for her, too. Not with a sword, not with shackles, but with something far worse. A cage made of sacred vows. A prison where no chains were needed because the sentence itself was eternal. A Vestal virgin. Bound to the gods. Bound to serve, to live untouched, untouched even by hope. She had no voice in this. No choice. Rhea Silvia's nails dug into her palms, her body trembling with something raw, something defiant, something screaming inside her even as she stood silent. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of him from the corner of her eye. The flickering torchlight carved shadows into his face, making him look almost inhuman. A king draped in stolen power, a man who had murdered his own blood and still called himself righteous. She wanted to spit in his face. To curse him. To scream that the gods were watching, that he would suffer for this. But Amulius only smiled. A priestess stepped forward, her gaze unreadable, her hands outstretched. Rhea Silvia's stomach twisted as cold fingers closed around her wrists. They were gentle, but there was no kindness in them. It was done. She was theirs now. A hush fell over the chamber, thick and unshakable. The silence of a burial. The silence of a life being stolen away, breath by breath, moment by moment. Rhea Silvia closed her eyes. Somewhere, the gods were watching. Somewhere, fate was stirring. And somewhere, beneath the weight of this cursed night, something was waiting to be born. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and crushed laurel leaves. The river murmured in the darkness, its waters restless, shifting, whispering secrets to the trees that loomed overhead. The night was watching. Holding its breath. Rhea Silvia stood at the edge of the forest, her white robes clinging to her skin, damp with the weight of the evening mist. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs, an unsteady rhythm that did not belong to the silence around her. She should not have come here. She knew this. And yet, something had pulled her forward, step by step, through the temple's walls, past the sleeping priestesses, past the stone corridors that had caged her since the day she had been sentenced to a life without touch, without love. A rustling in the shadows. Not the wind. Something else. Her breath caught. Her hand clenched the fabric of her robes. The leaves trembled, as if a presence had slipped through them, unseen but undeniable. The air was charged, humming with an energy that called around her like invisible hands, pressing against her skin, against her lungs, until she felt she might drown in it. And then, she felt him. Before she saw him, she felt him. A presence vast and immeasurable, a force that did not belong to this world, stepping into it, into her, into the marrow of her bones. She turned. And he was there. Mars. The god of war. The god of blood and conquest, the god whose name was whispered before battle, whose favor decided the fate of empires. He should not have been beautiful. He should not have been anything but wrath and fire and ruin. But in the moonlight, his form was shadow and silver, his eyes burning embers, his lips curved into something both knowing and dangerous. You are afraid. His voice was low, rich, an echo of something ancient. Rhea Silvia's throat was dry. She should have fallen to her knees. She should have turned away, should have begged for mercy, should have prayed to whatever god still cared to watch. But she did none of these things. I am not afraid. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. No. She lifted her chin. No, the silence stretched between them, taut and trembling. And then he moved. Not walked. Moved. As if the shadows carried him, as if the night itself bent to his will. He was inches from her now, close enough that the heat of him bled into her skin, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, the way his breath barely stirred the space between them. You called to me, he murmured. She shook her head. I did not. A slow smile. Not with words. His fingers brushed against her wrist, the lightest touch, a spark against her flesh. The river roared in the distance, the trees swayed, the world tilted. She had been touched before, briefly, by the priestesses who had led her to the altar, by the cold wind that swept through the temple corridors. But never like this. Never with fire. Never with hunger. I should not be here, she whispered. He tilted his head, considering. And yet you are. A war god did not ask. He took. He conquered. And yet he waited. Waited for her to close the distance. Waited for her breath to steady. Waited for her to decide. Her hands trembled as they found his chest, pressing against the fabric that covered him, feeling the solid weight beneath. He was not a spirit, not a dream conjured from loneliness. He was real. His pulse beat strong beneath her touch, an impossible rhythm, a song of war and death and glory. He was fire, and she was stepping into the flames. His mouth was on hers before she could take another breath. Not soft. Not tender. This was not the love of mortals, hesitant and unsure. This was war. A battle waged between flesh and need, between what should not be and what was inevitable. The night burned around them. The river raged. And the gods, wherever they were, watched in silence. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. The screams had long since died, swallowed by the thick, suffocating air of the chamber. The torches flickered violently, their flames clawing at the shadows, the scent of burning oil mixing with the sharp tang of sweat and blood. The earth itself seemed to shudder, as if something unnatural had been wrenched into existence, something that should never have been. Rhea Silvia lay motionless, her breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. Her body was weak, trembling, undone by the agony that had racked her for what felt like an eternity. And yet, her eyes were wild, searching, desperate. She could hear them, small, fragile cries piercing the silence, shattering the weight of exhaustion that threatened to crush her. Twins. Her twins. Her sons. She reached for them, but rough hands seized her wrists, yanking her back against the cold stone. The priestesses did not look at her. Their faces were carved from ice, their movements brisk, mechanical. She was not a mother to them. She was a vessel. A sacrilege. A mistake that must be erased. The infants wailed, their tiny voices raw with life, with defiance. And then, footsteps. Heavy. Measured. Unforgiving. Romulus. His presence filled the chamber before he even stepped inside. The air grew thick, charged, poisoned by the weight of his fury. The door groaned open, revealing a figure draped in black, his eyes burning with something darker than rage. Disgust. Rhea Silvia forced herself up, her body screaming in protest. No, the word barely left her lips, more breath than sound. Romulus did not look at her. His gaze was locked onto the writhing bundles in the priestess's arms. His jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists. Take them, he said, his voice a blade slicing through the air. Rhea Silvia thrashed against her captors, her screams raw, broken. No. No, you cannot. They are innocent. Innocent? Romulus turned to her then, his lips curling in a twisted mockery of a smile. Do you think the gods care for innocence? Do you think I do? The twins cried louder, their tiny limbs flailing, their bodies racked with the first terror of their lives. Romulus stepped closer. They should not exist. Rhea Silvia sobbed, her entire body convulsing. Please, she whispered. Please, I will do anything. Romulus crouched before her, his face inches from hers, his breath cold against her cheek. You already have, he murmured. And that is why they must die. A priestess hesitated, her hands trembling as she cradled one of the infants. Romulus' eyes snapped to her. Do it. She flinched, but obeyed. The children were wrapped in cloth, their cries muffled as they were carried away, out of the chamber, out of their mother's reach. Rhea Silvia screamed until her voice broke, until her body collapsed against the stone, until she could no longer breathe, no longer think, no longer exist. Romulus straightened, adjusting the folds of his cloak as he turned to leave. Drown them, he ordered. And then he was gone. The chamber was silent. The torches flickered. Rhea Silvia did not move. Somewhere, in the distance, the Tiber River roared. The river was restless. Its surface shivered under the weight of a leaden sky, dark waters slithering over jagged stones, swallowing the land in a slow, relentless hunger. It was as if the river knew what was coming. As if it could feel the life about to be stolen. As if it mourned in advance. Two bundles, small and fragile, shuddered in the arms of the man standing at the riverbank. His breath came in uneven bursts, mist curling from his lips. His fingers, thick and calloused, clenched around the damp cloth that wrapped the infants, warm, living bodies pressed against his chest. They were light. Too light. He could still feel the heat of them, the soft rise and fall of their tiny chests, the fluttering heartbeat beneath layers of fabric. They were alive. And he was about to kill them. A sharp gust of wind howled through the trees, a warning or a whisper, but the order had been given. Amulius' voice still rang in his ears, cold, absolute. Drown them. His hands trembled. The twins whimpered, their cries too weak to fight against the roar of the water, but they were crying, clinging to life without knowing they were moments away from being lost to it. He took a step forward. The mud swallowed his boots. The water churned. Another step. His arms stiffened, the weight of his crime pressing into his bones. One drop. That was all it would take. He bent over, his grip tightening. His heart slammed against his ribs, his breath caught somewhere between his ribs and his throat. The river reached for them. And then, a sound. A branch snapping in the distance. A rustle in the undergrowth. He twisted, eyes darting to the trees. Nothing. Only shadows stretching long and thin, weaving between the trunks like silent sentinels. But something was there. Watching. The twins stirred again, their small fists wriggling free from the cloth, grasping at nothing. Or perhaps grasping at something unseen, something greater, something waiting. His pulse hammered. He knew stories. Stories of gods who did not forget, of ancestors who watched from the wind, of omens hidden in the eyes of beasts. And this felt wrong. The river did not want them. He swallowed hard, his throat burning. If he let them live, Amulius would find out. If he drowned them, something worse might. The water swirled at his feet, the current curling around his legs like fingers pulling him closer, urging him to finish what he had started. One drop. That was all it would take. But his hands would not move. The twins mewed again, their tiny sounds nothing more than a whisper in the vast, uncaring world. And yet, they filled the space around him, growing louder, stronger, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. He turned his head, one last time, towards the trees. No one there. But he felt it. Something was waiting. Something was listening. His jaw tightened. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. And then, he stepped back. His grip loosened. The river could not have them. Not today. Not ever. With careful hands, he lowered the infants into the worn, woven basket at his feet. The reeds bent beneath their weight, the fibers creaking, but it would hold. It had to. He lifted the basket and set it adrift. The current caught it, pulling it away, carrying it forward into the unknown. The man stood frozen, watching as the water cradled the helpless bodies he had spared. The river had rejected death. Now it had chosen something else. And far beyond the bend, hidden in the folds of the forest, the god stirred. The wind howled through the empty valley, dragging with it the scent of wet earth, decay, and something else, something small, fragile, alive. The river had abandoned them, its currents too gentle, too reluctant to claim the lives meant for death. Now, they lay in the reeds, soaked, shivering, untouched by the hands of men but not yet claimed by the wilderness. Night crept closer. The sky, heavy with bruised clouds, watched in silence as the last light of the day bled into the trees. The air was thick, humming with unseen eyes, the breath of the forest held in waiting. Something was coming. A shadow slipped between the trees. Low to the ground, powerful, deliberate, her movements were silent as death. Muscles coiled beneath a pelt of matted fur, streaked with mud, with old blood. Her ribs jutted through her skin, sharp and unforgiving. Hunger gnawed at her belly, twisting, demanding. She had gone too long without the warmth of a fresh kill. And now, there was scent. Not prey. Not like the weak-legged deer or the reckless hares she chased in the darkness. This was different. It was small. It was warm. It was helpless. The she-wolf's ears flicked forward. Her nostrils flared, drinking in the scent, following the pull of something more than hunger. She found them where the river had left them, their tiny bodies tangled in reeds and damp cloth, skin flushed with the cold. They stirred, mewling softly, the sound barely more than a whimper against the vast, merciless night. She stepped closer. Her breath ghosted over their faces, her nostrils flaring. They did not flinch. They did not recoil in terror the way creatures should when death hovered over them. They simply breathed. Lived. Her teeth ached. She could end them. A quick snap of her jaws, and their cries would cease. But she did not bite. Instead, her lips curled back, nostrils flaring again, inhaling something beyond scent, beyond flesh and blood. Something older than hunger, deeper than instinct. It ran beneath their skin, through their tiny, pulsing veins. Something ancient. Something bound to fate. The forest watched. She growled, low and uncertain, as if challenging whatever force had placed these small, breakable things in her path. There was no answer. Only the wind, whistling through the reeds. Her belly twisted again, but not from hunger. The larger of the two stirred, turning blindly toward her warmth, pressing a tiny fist against her muzzle. She did not move. The second followed, barely breathing, clinging to the last shreds of life. A decision was made. She lowered her body, curling her massive frame around them, shielding them from the night's bite. Their small bodies pressed against her, stealing warmth from the beast that should have killed them. She felt their hearts, tiny and quick, pulsing against her ribs. Something ancient shifted in the marrow of her bones. She licked the smaller one first, rough tongue dragging across soft, salt-streaked skin. Then the other. Again. Again. Cleaning them, warming them, claiming them. The forest exhaled. Above, the stars blinked awake, their cold light spilling through the trees, illuminating the impossible sight, a creature of fang and claw, cradling the forsaken sons of a dying kingdom. They should not have survived the river. They should not have survived the cold. They should not have survived her. And yet, they breathed. Her own breath slowed, sinking with theirs. The night stretched long, and the hunger in her belly faded, replaced by something else, something unnamed. Tomorrow, she would carry them to her den. Tomorrow, she would fight for them. Tomorrow, she would teach them how to survive. For now, they slept against her warmth, their fates entwined, bound by something greater than blood. And in the stillness, as the wind hushed and the stars watched, the first seeds of a legend took root. The old man had seen many strange things in his life. But nothing like this. He stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, breath shallow, the weight of his staff pressing into the earth. The morning fog clung to the ground, curling around his feet like restless ghosts. His flock grazed in uneasy silence, the sheep shifting as if sensing something beyond human sight. The scent of the forest filled his lungs, wet leaves, damp earth, the sharp musk of an animal. But beneath it all, something else. Something raw. Something human. Then, the growl. Low. Warning. His grip tightened on the staff, the knotted wood pressing into his calloused palm. A wolf. He knew that sound, had heard it 100 times before in the dead of night when predators prowled too close to his flock. But this was different. It came from ahead. From the den. He stepped forward, cautious, every instinct screaming against it. The mist parted as he moved, revealing the entrance of a hollow beneath the roots of an ancient tree. And inside, the beast. Massive, its fur tangled with dirt and dried blood. Yellow eyes, burning like embers, locked onto his. Its body curled protectively around, he stopped breathing. Two small bodies. Children. They lay nestled against the she-wolf's flank, their tiny fingers tangled in her fur. Sleeping. Alive. He took another step, slow, deliberate. The wolf tensed, a snarl curling from its throat. Another step. The growl deepened. His heart hammered against his ribs. Any wrong move, and it would be over. Not for him, he had made peace with death long ago. But for them. For the boys. He knelt, setting the staff aside, hands open, empty. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I mean no harm." The she-wolf did not blink. Her ears flicked back, her muscles coiled. A heartbeat stretched into eternity. Then, she exhaled. A slow, weary breath. And with it, something passed between them, something unspoken. She knew. Somehow, she knew. He reached out, hands trembling as he lifted the first child. The boy stirred, warmth bleeding into his palms. So small. So impossibly fragile. The second followed, heavier, his tiny fingers curling instinctively against the fabric of the old man's tunic. The wolf watched, unmoving. He stood, cradling them both against his chest. The scent of the wild still clung to their skin, the lingering warmth of the beast who had saved them. His legs felt weak as he turned away, stepping back into the mist, back toward the world of men. Behind him, the she-wolf let out a final breath. Not a growl. Not a snarl. Something softer. Then, silence. He did not look back. The path was long, winding through the wilderness, the weight in his arms growing heavier with every step. The sun had begun its slow rise, setting the treetops ablaze with gold. His home was not far now. A voice called from the distance. A woman's voice. He pushed forward. And when he reached the threshold of his home, when he stepped into the warmth of the firelight, when he saw the face of his wife, wide-eyed, breath caught in her throat, he knew. Everything had changed. The wind howled through the hills like a wounded animal. It was the kind of night that pressed against the skin, that whispered of things lurking beyond sight. The fire flickered, barely holding its own against the cold, casting wild shadows on the faces of men who knew no laws but their own. In the half-light, two boys moved among them, barefoot, silent, watching. Romulus stood first. Always first. His eyes, dark and unyielding, swept the gathered men like a wolf surveying his pack. He was young, too young for the kind of hardness already settled in his bones, but the wild had carved him into something sharper than his years. Remus was close behind, quieter, a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth, always on the verge of laughter, though there was no humor in it. They were not like the others. The shepherds knew it. The outlaws knew it. Even the animals seemed to know it, their ears flicking back, their eyes wary when the twins moved too close. No one questioned where they had come from anymore. They had proven themselves in blood and silence. The first time Romulus killed a wolf, he did it with his bare hands. The beast had come in the night, silent, swift, the scent of hunger thick in the air. It had taken down a lamb, its teeth sinking deep into soft flesh, the crack of bones lost in the wind. Romulus had not hesitated. He had lunged, his fingers burying themselves in the coarse fur, his arms locking around the wolf's neck as they tumbled together into the dirt. The world narrowed to the beast's snarls, the hot breath against his skin, the bite that tore through his shoulder. Remus had watched. Not interfering. Not flinching. When it was over, when the wolf lay still and the boy rose, blood streaked across his face, something changed. The shepherds whispered of it. The outlaws, hardened men with blades at their belts and crimes in their past, gave the boys space. They were not ordinary. They did not belong to fields or flocks. They belonged to the wild. They ran through the trees with the feral grace of creatures born to the hunt. They knew every twist of the river, every hidden path, every cave where men spoke in hushed tones of things forbidden. They stole what they needed, fought when they had to, laughed in the face of danger. One night, a man raised his hand against them. A mistake. He had been a thief, a murderer, a man whose name was spoken with caution. He had expected submission. A lowering of the eyes. A step back. Romulus had struck first. No hesitation. No warning. The man had staggered, blood blooming where the blade found home. Remus had laughed then, low and sharp, the sound of a storm rolling in from the mountains. The men had stared. The boys were not just boys. They were something else. The hills carried their names now, whispered between shepherds, muttered over firelight. Some said they were touched by the gods. Others swore they were not men at all but creatures of the land itself, shaped by tooth and claw, by the blood of wolves and the breath of the river. But Romulus and Remus did not care for whispers. They lived. They fought. They waited. For what, they did not know. But the wind carried something with it, something heavy and unseen, something neither man nor beast could name. The first body hit the ground with a dull, lifeless thud. Silence followed. Heavy. Watching. Holding its breath. The man had challenged Romulus. A fool's mistake. Now his blood seeped into the dirt, dark and glistening beneath the moon's hollow gaze. Around them, the others stood frozen, torn between fear and something far more dangerous, respect. Romulus stepped forward, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. His hands, still smeared with the fight, hung at his sides, steady, unshaken. His voice, when it came, was not loud, yet it carved through the night like a blade. "Who else?" No one spoke. The fire crackled. The wind murmured. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely, aching sound that sent a shiver through the gathered men. Remus laughed, low and sharp, his amusement curling like smoke in the cold air. He stood beside his brother, effortless in his confidence, his hands resting loosely on his belt, but his stance was anything but relaxed. He was ready. Always ready. They were not boys anymore. They were leaders. It hadn't happened all at once. It had been slow, like a storm building over the hills, silent at first, whispering its intent through darkening skies. The shepherds had noticed it first. How the others followed them without question. How their words carried weight, heavier than the threat of a blade. The outlaws, men who bowed to no one, found themselves waiting for Romulus' nod before making their move. Even the old men, those who had seen empires rise and fall, had begun to listen when the twins spoke. Strength was easy to understand. But this was something else. It was in the way Romulus stood, his gaze unwavering, his presence like an unspoken challenge. It was in the way Remus moved, fluid and unpredictable, always circling, always watching, a wild thing with a grin that never quite reached his eyes. They were different, and everyone knew it. One night, a group of raiders came through the valley. They were brutal men, hardened by the road, their hands stained with crimes too many to count. They took what they wanted. They left nothing but fear in their wake. Or so they thought. They did not expect the twins. The battle was not planned. It did not wait for strategy or speeches. It began with Romulus stepping forward, his voice calm, almost amused. "Leave." The leader of the raiders laughed. Then he was dead. Romulus did not wait for the others to react. His blade was already moving, swift and merciless, cutting through flesh, through bone, through the illusion of control the raiders thought they had. Remus was a shadow at his side, a blur of movement, his laughter ringing through the chaos like something unholy. By the time the last raider fell, the valley was silent again. The men who had fought beside them, the shepherds, the thieves, the outcasts, looked at them differently after that. Not just with fear. Not just with respect. With loyalty. Something unspoken passed between them that night, something far stronger than blood. Romulus and Remus did not need to claim leadership. It had already been given to them. The stench of blood lingered in the air, thick and metallic. A single torch flickered in the cold wind, casting jagged shadows over the crumpled body in the dirt. His throat was open, gaping, leaking warmth into the earth. His eyes, still wide with the shock of death, stared up at the unforgiving sky. Romulus crouched beside him, fingers pressing into the wet soil. He wasn't looking at the corpse. He was listening. The cattle were restless. Low, uneasy sounds rose from the herd in the distance, their massive bodies shifting in nervous waves. Something had stirred them before the slaughter. Not just the scent of death. Not just the struggle. The thieves had come again. Remus stood a few feet away, arms folded, his face unreadable. But his pulse hammered against his skin, hot and alive with something close to hunger. "They took more this time," he murmured. Romulus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The rage inside him was a slow-burning thing, steady, controlled. He had seen the tracks leading away, too many of them, their boot prints sinking heavy into the earth. The brigands weren't hiding anymore. They were taunting. It had started as theft. A few cows, missing in the night. A trail leading off into the hills, disappearing before it could be followed. Then it had escalated, slashed throats, butchered remains left to rot, a cruel message carved into flesh. But this was different. The thieves had killed one of their own. Left his body behind like a discarded carcass, daring them to act. The firelight danced across Romulus' face as he stood, slow and deliberate. The men around him, the ones who had gathered in the wake of the slaughter, waited. Their breaths shallow. Their bodies tense. Romulus turned to them, eyes sharp, voice like carved stone. "No more." It wasn't a command. It was a promise. They hunted at first light. The sky was the color of a blade, the wind carrying the scent of damp earth and something bitter, anticipation, perhaps. The men rode in silence, weapons strapped to their backs, muscles coiled with waiting violence. Romulus rode at the front, his jaw locked, his grip firm on the reins. Remus was beside him, smiling. A thin, sharp thing that never quite reached his eyes. They followed the tracks through the hills, through tangled underbrush and rocky slopes that twisted like the ribs of a dying beast. Hours passed. The tension thickened. And then a noise. Soft. Just a shift of movement. But enough. Romulus lifted his hand. Every man behind him froze. A twig snapped. The first brigand never saw it coming. Remus was on him before he could draw breath, a blade sliding between his ribs, silencing him in a rush of blood. He choked once, then sagged, slipping into the dirt like a broken puppet. The others reacted too late. The battle was not a battle. It was a massacre. Romulus moved like death-given form, every strike precise, every motion calculated. There was no hesitation, no wasted energy, only the brutal efficiency of a man who had decided the outcome before the fight began. Remus laughed as he fought, a wild, reckless sound, a hymn of chaos. The brigands screamed. They begged. None were spared. When it was over, the valley was silent again. The only movement was the slow, dark trickle of blood soaking into the ground. Romulus wiped his blade clean, his eyes scanning the carnage without a flicker of emotion. Remus exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the weight of something unseen. "They won't come back," he said. Romulus nodded. They wouldn't. The first thing Remus felt was cold stone pressing into his cheek. His arms were twisted behind him, raw from the ropes that bit into his skin. Blood crusted over his temple, thick and clotted, the wound still throbbing in time with his pulse. His mouth tasted of copper and dust. He exhaled, slow, steady, ignoring the sting in his ribs, ignoring the weight pressing down on his chest. Somewhere in the darkness, a voice murmured. Low. Amused. A boot nudged his side. Remus opened his eyes. Torchlight burned in the cavernous space, casting cruel shadows along the rough-hewn walls. Men gathered at the edges, their faces blurred by the flickering glow. Their eyes, though, he could feel them. Watching. Measuring. He didn't recognize them. But he knew what they were. Alba Longa's dogs. One of them stepped forward. The leader? Tall, broad-shouldered, draped in a wolfskin cloak. His face was hard, sculpted by war and age, his jaw shadowed with an iron-stiff beard. He crouched, meeting Remus at eye level, his lips curling into something that might have been a smile. You caused quite a stir, boy. Remus didn't answer. A hand shot out, seizing his jaw, tilting his head. Cold fingers pressed against the wound at his temple, digging into the tender flesh. Remus gritted his teeth. The man studied him, his grip tightening, his expression unreadable. Then, low, quiet, he whispered, "You have your grandfather's eyes." Something shivered through the air. A weight. A truth, unspoken but thick enough to choke on. Remus didn't move. The man leaned in, his breath warm against Remus' ear. "You think you're a wild thing? A king of outlaws?" His voice dropped, sharp as a knife. "You are blood. Royal blood. And you don't even know it." Laughter rippled through the gathered men. Remus forced himself to breathe, to still the storm rising in his chest. The leader pulled back, standing, wiping his hands as if Remus was something filthy that had tainted him. "Tie him up outside," he ordered. "Let's see how long the wolf cub lasts without his pack." The men moved, dragging him to his feet, shoving him toward the yawning night beyond the stone walls. And through the roar of his heartbeat, one thought echoed. Romulus was coming. The iron doors groaned open, scraping against the stone floor like the growl of a wounded beast. Remus was shoved forward. His knees buckled, but he caught himself before he fell, his breath hissing between his teeth. The guards behind him chuckled, their hands still slick with his blood. They had worked him over well. A swollen lip, a fresh bruise blooming over his cheekbone, dried streaks of crimson stiffening against his tunic. But it wasn't enough to break him. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of burning oils and something darker, something sour, like rotting power. Before him, sitting atop a throne carved from black stone, was the man who had condemned him before he had even drawn his first breath. King Romulus. The tyrant lounged, draped in a cloak dyed the color of spilled wine. Rings adorned his fingers, gold and gems gleaming in the flickering torchlight. His eyes, black as a snake's, settled on Remus with the cold curiosity of a predator watching a wounded stag struggle to stand. For a moment, silence. Then, Romulus laughed. A low, indulgent chuckle that slithered through the air like something alive. "So," he mused, his voice slow, deliberate. "This is the mongrel they dragged from the hills." Remus didn't answer. He straightened, squared his shoulders, and lifted his chin, refusing to bow, refusing to look away. Romulus' lips curled. "You look like him, you know." He swirled the wine in his goblet, watching the liquid stain the sides like blood. "Your father. That worthless, sniveling brat who thought he could take my throne." The words coiled in Remus' gut like a burning rope. Father. A word he had never spoken. A face he had never known. But it was real. The weight of it, the taste of it, bitter as the blood on his tongue. "Ah," Romulus murmured, tilting his head, watching. "You didn't know, did you?" His smile sharpened. "Of course you didn't. You were supposed to die before you could crawl." The air seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer. Remus could feel the guards shift behind him, waiting, their fingers twitching near their blades. He could hear his own pulse, a steady drumbeat against his skull. But Romulus wasn't done. He leaned forward, resting his chin against his fist. "The she-wolf that suckled you, or was she warm, little beast? Did she whisper to you in the dark, tell you that you were something more?" His words dripped poison, slow, seeping into the cracks, curling around old wounds. Remus clenched his jaw, his nails biting into his palms. "Tell me," Romulus continued, his voice almost gentle now, as if speaking to a child. "Did she ever tell you that you were mine to kill?" Something inside Remus snapped. He lunged. A hand caught his throat before he could reach the throne. The guards were on him, slamming him to the ground, boots crushing against his ribs. Pain flashed, white-hot, as fists and steel struck flesh and bone. But Romulus only laughed. Laughed as Remus gasped for breath. Laughed as the torches hissed and flickered. Laughed as, far beyond the palace walls, the first distant howl rose into the night. The night was thick with silence. Not the gentle quiet of sleep, but the kind that suffocates, that smothers breath, that waits for blood. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of wet stone and distant torches burning in the heart of Alba Longa. Romulus crouched in the shadows, his hand tightening around the worn leather of his sword's hilt. His breath was steady, but his heart pounded like war drums in his chest. Somewhere beyond those towering walls, his brother was shackled, bruised, waiting. Waiting for the dawn. Waiting for death. Not tonight. A guard shifted atop the battlements, his armor clinking softly. Romulus watched, his muscles coiled, every fiber of his being a blade drawn tight. The others were waiting, too, hidden in the darkness, breathless and ready. A single signal. A single spark. Then the night shattered. The first arrow struck clean through a sentry's throat. He didn't even have time to scream before his body crumpled like broken parchment. Another fell, his torch dropping from his hand, rolling across the stone like a dying sun. Then the wolves came. Not beasts of fur and fang, but men, hunters, warriors, those who had fought and bled beside Romulus in the wild. They climbed the walls like specters, knives glinting, teeth bared. The city guards barely had time to react before the gates were wrenched open from within. Romulus surged forward, his sword flashing in the torchlight as he cut through the first man that dared stand in his path. The clash of steel rang out, sharp and relentless. Blood sprayed the walls. Screams ripped through the night. Romulus didn't stop. He moved through the chaos like a storm, his mind locked onto a single thought. Remus. He drove his blade into another soldier, shoving the dying man aside as he stormed through the city streets. Shadows twisted and writhed as bodies fell. The scent of iron choked the air. Then he saw it. The prison tower. A beast rose inside him. He sprinted, cutting through the last line of guards, his men right behind him. The doors wouldn't last long, not against their fury, not against the wrath that had been simmering since the moment they dragged Remus away. The wooden beams shattered under the weight of their assault. Romulus tore through the dark halls, his breath ragged. He didn't feel the exhaustion, didn't feel the sting of the cuts along his arms. Then, he saw him. Remus. Bruised. Bloodied. Crouched in the corner of his cell, his wrists bound in rusted chains. Their eyes met. For a single moment, time froze. Then Romulus roared. The cell door splintered beneath his boot. He fell to his knees, hands already yanking at the chains, his fingers slipping against the blood-streaked iron. Remus coughed, a dry, broken sound. "You took your time," he rasped, the ghost of a grin tugging at his split lip. Romulus let out a breathless laugh, fierce and wild. "Shut up," he muttered. Then the alarm bells rang. Reinforcements. No time. Romulus wrenched the chains apart with one final, brutal pull. Remus staggered, but Romulus caught him. Held him steady. Then together, they ran. The torches outside the palace burned low, their flickering light stretching the shadows of armed men against the stone walls. The night held its breath. A suffocating silence wrapped around the city, thick with the weight of what was coming. The scent of war clung to the wind, the sharp bite of steel and the smolder of burning oil. Amulius sat on his throne, his fingers tapping against the armrest. He was waiting. He had heard the whispers. He had seen the tension coil in the faces of his men, in the fearful glances of his servants. Romulus had returned. The ground trembled with the first impact, fists pounding against the palace gates, a battering ram slamming into the wooden barrier that had held firm for years. The guards rushed to their posts, their armor clanking, voices barking orders over the rising din. A second strike. The wood groaned. A third. The gates exploded inward. They poured in like a flood. Romulus at the front, his sword flashing in the torchlight, his eyes burning with fury. Remus beside him, his knuckles white against the hilt of his blade. The air split open with the clash of metal, the screams of dying men swallowed by the frenzy of battle. Amulius rose. He was old, but not weak. His grip tightened around his sword as he watched his men fall, blood slicking the marble floor. The twins were unstoppable, cutting through the ranks with the ferocity of wolves tearing through prey. The king's breath was steady, but he could feel it, the end curling its fingers around his throat. Romulus fought like something unleashed, something that had been chained for too long and had finally broken free. His strikes were precise, merciless. A soldier lunged at him, he twisted, the blade missing him by an inch before his own weapon sliced through the man's ribs. Remus fought with wild strength, a storm that crashed into his enemies without pause. His fury was a living thing, raw and relentless. His blade tore through flesh, his boots kicking bodies aside as he carved a path forward. The throne room doors loomed ahead. Amulius knew they were coming. He turned to his last remaining guards. "Hold," he commanded, his voice iron. "Kill them." The doors burst open. Romulus stepped inside first, his breath ragged, blood staining his arms, his chest, his face. Remus was at his side, his blade dripping onto the polished stone. Amulius watched them, his expression unreadable. He did not run. He did not beg. The room was silent. Then, the king smiled. A cold, knowing smile. "You think this is justice?" His voice was calm, even as the flames of battle roared behind the twins. "You think the gods have blessed your hands?" Romulus lifted his sword. "They didn't have to." He struck. Amulius parried, their blades shrieking against each other. The old king was fast, moving with the grace of a warrior who had fought and killed for decades. His counterattack was swift, forcing Romulus to step back, but Remus was already there, his sword swinging toward the king's exposed side. Amulius twisted, barely dodging in time. He laughed. A sharp, hollow sound. "Is that all?" Then he lunged. Romulus barely managed to block, the force of the strike sending a shock through his arms. Amulius pressed forward, his movements relentless. His age did not slow him, it sharpened him. He had ruled with blood. He would not fall easily. But the twins had not come this far to fail. Remus feinted left, Amulius turned, Romulus struck. His blade tore through the king's armor, slicing into his ribs. Amulius stumbled, blood spilling from his lips. He caught himself, his grip tightening around his sword, refusing to fall. Romulus met his gaze. "This is for our mother," he said. The final strike came swift and brutal. Amulius staggered, his body crashing against the throne. The weight of his reign collapsed with him. The silence that followed was deafening. The throne room was still stained with blood. The scent of iron clung to the air, thick, metallic, suffocating. Shadows stretched long across the cold stone, flickering as the torches wavered in their sconces. The body of Amulius lay motionless at the foot of the throne, his once powerful form crumpled in the same place he had ruled from for years. His crown, loosened in death, had rolled away, its golden edges slick with crimson. Romulus stood over him, chest heaving, sword still clenched in his grip. Remus wiped the blood from his blade with slow, deliberate movements. Neither twin spoke. The silence was heavier than the battle, heavier than the screams that had filled these halls only moments before. A sound. Soft. Uncertain. The shuffle of feet at the entrance. The old man stepped forward. His eyes, aged by sorrow and exile, swept the room. Numita. For years, he had lived as a ghost of the king he once was, a man whose throne had been stolen, whose daughter had been cast to ruin, whose grandsons had been lost to fate. And now, here he stood, watching the last breath of his brother's tyranny dissipate into the still air. The flickering light caught his face, tracing the lines carved by grief and time. His hands, trembling slightly, reached out as if to grasp something that was no longer there. The weight of it, the years lost, the kingdom stolen, the child sacrificed, pressed down on his shoulders. Romulus turned to him, his voice raw. "It's over." Numita did not answer. He stepped forward, slow and measured, until he stood before the throne. His eyes lingered on the golden seat, then on the man who had died trying to keep it. He bent down, his fingers brushing against the crown. It was heavier than he remembered. The soldiers who had once served Amulius stood at the edges of the room, uncertain. Their armor bore the marks of battle, their swords still red. They had fought for a king who now lay lifeless at their feet. And now they waited for the next command, for the next ruler, for the moment that would decide whether they lived or died. Numitor lifted the crown. A murmur swept through the hall. Some gasped. Others bowed their heads. The old king turned, his gaze falling upon the twins who had carved his path back to power with their own hands, their own blood. Romulus and Remus, sons of the woman who had been stolen from him. The grandsons he had thought lost. "You were never meant to live," Numitor said, his voice quiet, but heavy with something that made the torches flicker. "And yet, you are here." Romulus met his gaze without flinching. "And so are you." A silence passed between them, thick with something unspoken, something neither of them knew how to name. Then, with slow, deliberate purpose, Numitor turned to the soldiers who had once sworn their loyalty to his brother. "Swear to me now," his voice rose, steady, unwavering. "Swear that you will no longer fight for a tyrant. Swear that you will no longer serve cruelty and fear." The soldiers shifted, glancing at one another. Their faces were torn, blooded from battle, etched with the uncertainty of men who had been following orders for so long that they had forgotten the weight of choice. And then, the first knee bent. One by one, they fell. A ripple, slow at first, then crashing like a tide. Swords were lowered, hands pressed to hearts. Numitor closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling a breath that had been trapped in his chest for decades. He had waited for this. He had fought, even when he had nothing left to fight with. And now, finally, he had returned. The crown in his hands felt colder than he remembered. He lifted it to his head. A kingdom restored. A debt repaid. And yet, in the shadows of the hall, Romulus and Remus stood motionless. Because this was not their throne. Their fate lay elsewhere. The wind howled through the high walls of Alba Longa, tearing at the banners still soaked in the blood of the fallen. It carried the scent of iron and smoke, weaving through the quiet streets like a whisper, like a warning. The city that had once been a prison, a battlefield, a kingdom reclaimed, now stood eerily still. Yet for Romulus and Remus, it was not home. It never had been. Romulus stood at the edge of the citadel, his hands clenched into fists, his body rigid as if the very stones beneath him tried to root him in place. Below, the city stretched in uneasy silence, its people waking from the nightmare of Amulius' reign. He should have felt triumph. He should have felt peace. But all he felt was the weight pressing down on his chest, thick and suffocating. Remus paced behind him, restless, like a wolf trapped in a cage. His fingers twitched at his sides, his breath coming fast and shallow. "This isn't where we belong." The words left his lips in a whisper, almost swallowed by the wind. Romulus did not turn. He already knew. He had always known. Numitor had reclaimed his throne. Justice had been dealt. But the blood on their hands was still warm, and the battle that had ended one reign had left something raw and open in them both. A hunger. A calling. "We should leave," Remus said, more forceful this time. "This city is his now. But it was never meant to be ours." Romulus exhaled, slow, measured. His fingers uncurled, but the tension in his jaw remained. "And where do we go?" Remus stopped pacing. His eyes burned in the dim light, something untamed flickering within them. "Somewhere new. Somewhere we can build. Not just take back what was lost, but create something of our own." The words hung between them, heavy with promise, with danger. Behind them, the city moved, breathed, lived. People whispered their names, eyes lingering on them with something between awe and unease. They had saved Alba Longa, but they were not of it. They were raised in the wild, hardened by the river, by the fangs of the she-wolf, by the unrelenting struggle to survive. They were not made for palaces, for soft words and quiet rule. Romulus turned at last. His gaze met his brother's, and in that instant, no more words were needed. They would leave. That night, they walked through the streets unnoticed, ghosts moving through a city that would soon forget them. They did not take gold. They did not take guards. They carried only their weapons, their scars, and the fire burning in their veins. As they passed the great hall, Numita stood in the doorway, watching. He did not call out to them. He did not ask them to stay. He had ruled once before. He knew what it meant to be bound to something greater than a throne. So he only nodded. And the twins walked into the darkness, toward a future yet unwritten, toward a land that did not yet bear a name, but soon would. The sun bled across the horizon, spilling gold and crimson over the untamed land. Shadows stretched long and jagged, creeping over the hills like silent sentinels watching, waiting. The air was thick with something unspoken, a promise, a threat, a challenge. Romulus ran his fingers over the hilt of his blade, his grip tightening with each passing second. His heart pounded, but not from fear. From longing. From something raw clawing at his chest, demanding to be answered. He turned to Remus, who stood a few paces away, surveying the land below. His brother's breath was steady, but his shoulders were rigid, as if the weight of the gods themselves pressed down on him. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating. Only the wind moved, whispering through the grass, curling around the edges of their cloaks. The river below gleamed like a coiled serpent, its waters shifting and restless. Hills rose on either side, their slopes sharp, unyielding. This land had never known kings. It had never bowed to any man. Romulus exhaled slowly. This could be it. Remus didn't answer right away. His eyes were distant, searching, as if the earth itself might speak to him. When he finally turned, his gaze burned. Or it could be nothing. Romulus felt the words cut, but he did not flinch. They had searched for days, weeks, moving from valley to valley, each place feeling close, so close, but never right. Too exposed. Too barren. Too cursed. None of them spoke to the wild thing inside them, the beast that had been raised on the riverbank, that had known hunger and survival before it knew language. They had not come this far for nothing. Remus stepped forward, kicking a loose rock over the edge. It tumbled, bouncing off the slope before vanishing into the waters below. "Do you feel it?" His voice was low, almost reverent. Romulus swallowed. He did. The land pulsed beneath them, ancient and waiting. It was not gentle. It was not forgiving. It did not offer itself freely. It dared them. Romulus turned his gaze to the hills rising on either side. They would not be easy to tame. That was good. Easy things were weak. Easy things were fleeting. Remus tilted his head, as if hearing something in the wind. But is it ours? Romulus felt the fire surge inside him, the answer already burning on his tongue. Not yet. The night crept over them, swallowing the sky in a sea of black. The stars blinked down like watchful eyes, cold and endless. They did not sleep. They did not speak. They only watched the land that might one day bear their names, the land that had not yet decided if it would let them take it. And in that silence, the choice was made. The wind held its breath. The earth, once restless beneath their feet, seemed to pause, waiting. The sky, vast and endless, was an open wound of grey, the promise of something, fate, ruin, glory, etched into its silence. Romulus stood atop the Palatine Hill, his fingers digging into the stone, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His eyes never left the sky. Somewhere beyond the hush, Remus waited on the Aventine, the same fire burning in his chest, the same hunger gnawing at his bones. But there could only be one. The gods had demanded a sign. The land would belong to the one they chose, the one they crowned with the flight of birds. A single raven cut through the air, its wings slicing through the silence like a blade. Romulus tensed, but it was not his. Not yet. His eyes burned, unblinking, his mind locked in a silent war with the heavens. Let them come. Let them see him. Let them choose. The waiting was unbearable, a torment that slithered beneath his skin, tightening like a noose. He could almost hear his brother's breath across the valley, could feel the same unbearable weight pressing down on them both. It would not be the sword that decided their fates. It would not be battle or blood. It would be this. A contest of patience. A contest of faith. Then, movement. Romulus inhaled sharply as a shadow broke through the clouds. Then another. And another. His heartbeat thundered. 6. No, 8. No, 12. 12 vultures, gliding in a perfect arc, circling above him like silent heralds. The gods had spoken. Fire surged through his veins, but he did not move. He did not cry out. He only watched, his entire body locked in that moment, his lungs burning with withheld breath. Across the way, a cry split the silence. Remus had seen. Romulus turned his gaze toward the distant hill, where his brother stood rigid, unmoving, his face unreadable even from afar. But Romulus could feel it. The heat of his fury, the cold edge of betrayal. Remus had seen 6 birds first. But Romulus had seen more. It was not enough to be first. The gods favored greatness. And they had chosen. The sky darkened, the wind exhaling again, heavy with something neither of them could name. The birds still circled above, indifferent to the war that had just begun. The night air crackled. A storm without lightning, a war without swords. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, alive, charged with something neither could name but both could feel. The city had not yet risen, but already it was a battlefield. Romulus stood rigid, his fingers curling into fists, his breath slow and heavy. He had won. The gods had chosen. The birds had sung his name, painted his victory in their flight. And yet, across the broken earth, Remus stood, unyielding. It is not yours. Remus's voice was low, tight with fury. His eyes burned in the half-light, twin embers smoldering beneath a storm-black brow. Romulus let the words sink in, cold steel against his ribs. His lips barely moved. The gods have spoken. Remus took a step forward. The earth groaned beneath him, as if it, too, carried the weight of what was coming. They spoke first to me. Romulus did not move. He had known this moment would come. The augury had not been enough. The gods had made their choice, but men were not gods. And men did not accept fate so easily. Remus's breath came sharp and fast. You think you are king? His voice was sharper than the blades strapped to their sides, more dangerous than the wolves that had once hunted them. Because of birds? Romulus felt his blood turn hot, the fury climbing his spine. He clenched his jaw. Because it was written. Remus laughed, but there was no joy in it. Only something broken. Something jagged. He turned, gesturing toward the empty land, the rolling hills that would soon hold walls and towers and power. This? His voice rose, the storm inside him breaking free. This dust? These stones? You think they make you a king? Romulus stepped forward now, slow, deliberate. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The gods make me king. A heartbeat. A silence so thick it choked the air. Then Remus was moving. He closed the distance in a breath, his hands shoving Romulus hard. Romulus stumbled but did not fall. Not yet. The air between them burned. The stars above seemed to hold their breath. You are nothing, Remus whispered, his face inches from Romulus's, his voice laced with venom. Not without me. Romulus stared into his brother's eyes and saw the truth. Not a threat. Not a challenge. A promise. The city would rise. But it would demand a price. And blood would be the mortar. The air was thick, unmoving. Not a whisper of wind. Not the rustle of a single leaf. The sky above held its breath, and the earth below braced for what was coming. The walls of the city, half-built and fragile, stood like silent witnesses to the battle they had not yet been baptized in. Remus stood at their base, his face carved from shadow and fury, his breath coming sharp and fast. He should not have been there. He should have walked away. But something inside him, something older than reason, heavier than fate, held him in place. Romulus was watching him. From the other side of the rising city, his hands clenched at his sides, his heartbeat a war drum against his ribs. This was his land. His kingdom. His future. And yet, Remus stood in defiance, his presence a wound that refused to heal. A silence stretched between them, stretching too thin, ready to snap. Then, Remus moved. One step. Another. Then a leap, effortless, over the fragile, half-formed wall. A challenge. A curse. A death wish. The world seemed to stop. Romulus saw it all in a single frozen moment, the flash of Remus's eyes, the smirk that cut across his face, the way his feet landed so carelessly on what had been built with sweat and stone and sacrifice. It was mockery. It was treason. It was war. Something broke inside Romulus. A dam, a thread, a final restraint. Then he was running. His body moved before his mind, before reason, before anything but the raw, burning force inside him that had no name and no mercy. Remus saw him coming. And he did not run. Instead, he smiled. A cold, knowing smile. The kind that held no fear. The kind that had lived too long in the shadow of another and had nothing left to lose. The sound of impact was not loud. Not the clash of steel, not the scream of war. Just the dull, sickening thud of flesh meeting flesh. Remus staggered back, his breath leaving him in a sharp exhale. Romulus did not stop. A second blow, harder this time, and Remus hit the ground. The dust rose around him, slow, weightless. He laughed. A weak, broken sound, like something unraveling. His head lolled to the side, his body twisting in the dirt, and when he looked up at Romulus, his smile was still there. "Is this what it takes?" His voice was quiet, hoarse. "To be king?" Romulus did not answer. His breath was ragged. His chest heaved. His hands trembled at his sides, fingers curling into fists. Remus pushed himself up onto one elbow, blood at the corner of his mouth. The dust clung to his skin, streaked his face, but his eyes burned with something fierce, something that had never bowed. He spat, red staining the earth. "You are nothing," he whispered. Romulus moved before the words had even left his lips. The blade was in his hand, sudden and absolute. It flashed once, caught the dying light. Then it sank home. Remus's breath hitched. His body stiffened. A tremor ran through him like a final, fading spark. For a moment, there was nothing. Then his lips parted, but no words came. No curses. No final cry of defiance. Just the soft, almost puzzled sound of air leaving his lungs. Romulus held the knife in place, his grip tightening, his knuckles white. He could feel the heartbeat beneath his hands, slowing. Then stopping. The silence that followed was absolute. Romulus let go. Remus crumpled, his body folding into the earth as if it had always belonged there. The dust settled. The blood seeped. The walls of the city stood unmoved. Romulus stepped back. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. The world did not stop. The stars did not fall. The gods did not speak. Only the wind moved, at last. Cold. Unforgiving. And the city rose. The world had not changed. The stars still burned overhead, cold and unfeeling. The wind still prowled through the hills, whispering secrets only the dead could hear. The unfinished walls of the city still stood, indifferent to the blood that had darkened the earth beneath them. But Romulus was alone. He stood over the body, his breath shallow, his fingers curled so tightly at his sides that his nails bit into his palms. Remus had not moved. Would never move again. His face was slack, empty of the fire that had burned so violently just moments before. His mouth, once quick to smirk, now parted in silence. His eyes, wide open, stared up at the sky as if searching for an answer that would never come. Romulus could not look away. The knife in his hand felt heavier now. He had held it without hesitation, driven it forward with purpose. But the weight of it, of what he had done, had found him at last, wrapping around his chest like iron bands, pressing down, down, down. He knelt. The ground was hard beneath him. Cold. His knees dug into the dirt beside his brother's body, but he did not feel the pain. His hands hovered over Remus, uncertain, shaking. There had been so much fury before, so much fire. Now, there was only silence. A tremor ran through him. He pressed his palm against his brother's chest, but there was no heartbeat beneath his skin. He had stopped it. A sound tore from his throat. Not a word, not a name. Something raw. Something that belonged to an animal, not a man. The others were watching. The men who had followed him, who had lifted their fists and cheered his name, now stood at a distance, uncertain, afraid. No one spoke. No one dared move. They had seen it happen. They had seen Remus fall. And yet, none of them had the words for what had been born in that moment. Romulus sucked in a breath. His body swayed forward before he caught himself. His fingers curled into the fabric of Remus's tunic, gripping, holding. As if he could pull him back. As if this were not real. But the blood was already cooling. The earth had already accepted him. Romulus's shoulders shuddered. The fire that had driven him, that had made his bones hum with fury, was gone now. What remained was hollow, aching. He let go. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. His limbs felt weak, unsteady. He lifted his gaze to the sky, but there were no gods watching. No sign. No omen. Only the vast, empty blackness stretching over him, indifferent to his grief. His men still waited. Silent. Expectant. They wanted something from him. A word. A command. An assurance that what had happened was meant to be, that it was not an ending but a beginning. But Romulus had no words. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy. The taste of blood lingered in the back of his mouth, sharp and metallic. His gaze dropped to Remus once more. His twin. His shadow. His first friend, his first enemy. And now, his first loss. He forced himself to move. The burial was not grand. There were no priests, no rites, no offerings. Just hands lifting the body, arms carrying him to the place where the earth would claim him. Romulus did not let anyone else touch him. He carried him alone. His steps were slow, measured. Each one felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of his brother was sinking into his bones, pressing him into the dirt with him. The grave was shallow. There had been no time for anything else. The men dug with their hands, with stones, with whatever they could find. The soil was rough, dry. It crumbled beneath their fingers, but it was not enough. It would never be enough. When the body was lowered, Romulus did not look away. He knelt at the edge, his fingers curling into the dirt. His breath was unsteady. His vision blurred. He wanted to say something. A word, a farewell. Anything to make this moment feel less like the shattering of something sacred. But the words would not come. So he took a handful of earth and let it fall. The first sound of soil striking the body was soft. But it was enough. Enough to make him flinch. Enough to make his breath hitch. Enough to make his fingers shake as he reached for another handful. The men followed. The grave filled. And Romulus stood, alone once more. The city rose around him, unfinished. The walls would continue to grow, the streets would take shape. His kingdom would come to life, brick by brick, under his rule. But the shadow of this moment would never leave. The blood had dried on his hands, but he could still feel it there, warm and fresh. The weight of the knife still lingered in his grip. The silence still stretched, vast and unending. Romulus lifted his head. He was king now. The only one. And the gods had not stopped him. His fate had been sealed, his path carved into the earth itself. The city would bear his name. The people would chant it. The legends would remember it. But beneath it all, beneath the triumph, the power, the legacy, there would always be this night. The night he buried his brother. The night the gods remained silent. The first strike of the axe sent a sharp echo rolling through the hills. It was a clean, merciless sound, slicing through the quiet of the early dawn like a blade against flesh. The trees trembled beneath it. The earth seemed to shudder. And the men, muscles taut and breath clouding in the cool air, did not hesitate. Another swing. Another impact. Wood splintered. Bark cracked open like bone giving way. A tree groaned, its roots clawing desperately at the soil, as if it knew what was coming, knew that this land would never belong to the wild again. Romulus stood among them, watching. His hands were stained, still, always, with the memory of his brother's blood. But his grip on the wooden shaft of his staff was steady. His shoulders squared, his chest rising with the weight of something greater than grief, greater than guilt. This was his city now. His alone. And it would be built with hands that obeyed him, with backs that bent under his command, with sweat and stone and blood. The trees crashed to the ground, sending leaves and dust into the air in a choking, blinding haze. The men moved quickly, cutting, dragging, shaping. Logs were stacked in uneven piles, their rough edges biting into palms and shoulders as they were hauled toward the chosen site. The foundation had been marked. A sacred line in the dirt. A boundary between what was and what would be. No one crossed it. Not yet. Not until Romulus gave the word. The sun clawed its way up the sky, merciless and hot, burning into the skin of the laborers as they dug, lifted, drove stakes into the earth. The sound of iron striking stone, of chisels biting into wood, of voices raised in commands and curses, filled the air, thick and suffocating. The city was being born. But it did not come easily. The land resisted. The ground beneath them was stubborn, forcing the men to strike harder, to push deeper, to bleed for every inch they claimed. The river watched from a distance, silent and still, its waters dark, unreadable. The hill stood witness, unmoving. And the sky carried no omens. No approval. No warning. Only the brutal, indifferent light of day. Romulus walked among the workers, his gaze sharp, his steps measured. He did not speak often, but when he did, the words cut as cleanly as the axes in the trees. His men obeyed without question. They had seen what happened to those who defied him. The walls would be strong. Stronger than any before them. They would rise like the ribs of a beast, caging the life within, keeping the world out. He would see to it himself. His fingers traced the rough edges of a stone that would soon form part of the city's skeleton. It was solid, unyielding. It would stand the test of time. Unlike men. Unlike brothers. The sun burned higher. The shadows stretched long and thin. The scent of sweat and soil filled the air, mixing with the distant, iron-rich memory of the past. A cry rang out. Romulus turned, his body coiled, his grip tightening. A man had fallen, crushed beneath the weight of a boulder that had slipped from unsteady hands. His leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. A moment of hesitation. A flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of the others. Romulus stepped forward. One motion. One order. The weak would not hold the strong. The city would not wait for a man who could no longer stand. The injured was dragged away, his cry swallowed by the sounds of progress. The walls continued to rise. Stone by stone. Blood by blood. The line was drawn. And soon, nothing would dare cross it. The firelight flickered against the crude stone walls, shadows writhing like restless spirits. The wind carried whispers from the hills, voices lost in the night, the sound of a world that had cast them aside. They came in ones and twos, limping, starving, eyes hollowed by hunger and exile. Some carried wounds still fresh, seeping beneath ragged bandages. Others had nothing but the weight of their crimes strapped to their backs. Thieves, murderers, runaways, men branded by kings and cast out by cities that no longer wanted them. The gates stood open. No guards. No questions. Only the silent understanding that what lay behind these walls was different. A place for those with no place. Rome. A nameless man stumbled through the threshold, his breath ragged, his body trembling from the cold. His feet bled from days of walking, but he did not stop. The scent of charred meat, of fire, of something human, lured him forward. Others watched him from the darkness, half-hidden figures crouched against the walls, hands resting on weapons or curled around stolen bread. No one spoke. They only stared. Weighing. Measuring. He was one of them now. Somewhere within the heart of the city, Romulus stood, watching the night swallow the land beyond his walls. He had sent no invitations, no summons. Yet they came, drawn by something greater than hunger or fear. The promise of something new. Something ruthless. He did not care why they came. Only that they would fight for what was his. The city swelled with the unwanted, the broken, the dangerous. Each night, more arrived, some barely alive, some dragging their past behind them like a noose. The weak were left to wither. The strong rose, sharpening themselves against the jagged edges of this place. Rome was not a refuge. It was a forge. A fight broke out near the market, steel flashing in the moonlight, the wet crunch of bone beneath fists. Blood painted the dirt, mixing with the filth of the streets. A man lay gasping, his hand pressed against a wound that would not close. No one rushed to help. Romulus watched. His city would not be built by the meek. It would be carved from the bones of those who dared to claim it. The wind carried the sounds of struggle, of life clawing for itself in the filth and darkness. And still, the outcasts came. The fire crackled low in the darkness, casting restless shadows across the gathered men. Silence held the air taut, thick with an unspoken fear, something primal, something gnawing at the bones of their ambition. Rome was growing. The walls stood taller. The streets pulsed with life, but something vital was missing. A slow rot had begun to coil around the heart of the city, unseen but suffocating. There were no women. The men of Rome had carved a sanctuary from nothing, turned blood and stone into something that could last. But without women, it was a dead thing. A corpse dressed in the illusion of greatness. The men knew it. Felt it. Their eyes flickered with unease, hands curling into fists when they thought no one was looking. Romulus stood among them, silent. His mind was already sharpening itself into a blade, slicing through the hesitation that clouded the others. He had built this city for those who had been cast aside, men who had lost everything and found their way to his gates. Now, they stood at the edge of oblivion, not because of war, not because of hunger, but because the future itself was slipping through their fingers. A city without sons. A land without daughters. A people without a next generation. It was unthinkable. It was unacceptable. The nights grew restless. Men spoke in hushed tones, their voices raw with the weight of desperation. Some abandoned Rome altogether, seeking companionship elsewhere. Others turned to the gods, whispering prayers into the dark, but the heavens did not answer. Romulus did not pray. He knew what had to be done. The Sabines. A neighboring people, strong, proud, with women who could bear the weight of Rome's future in their wombs. They would never come willingly. They would never see the men of Rome as anything but outcasts and criminals. So, the choice was made for them. A festival. A grand spectacle. Laughter would ring through the air, wine would flow like rivers, and beneath the golden sun, trust would be forged, only to be shattered in an instant. Rome had taken its land by force. Now, it would take its future the same way. The decision burned in the chests of every man who heard it. Some hesitated. Others felt the thrill of something ancient and brutal awaken in their veins. The night before the festival, the city pulsed with an unspoken hunger, a restless anticipation that sent shivers through the air. And when the sun rose, Rome prepared to claim what it needed. The air was thick with music, the scent of roasted meat curling through the streets, laughter rising in waves that rolled over the gathering. The Sabines had come in peace, their women adorned in garlands, their eyes bright with the glow of festival fires. Rome had never looked so welcoming, so alive. It was a celebration of strength, of friendship, of something that did not yet have a name. And then the laughter stopped. It happened in a breath. A single heartbeat. A scream split the evening, raw and jagged, shattering the illusion of revelry. Hands tore through silk, fingers clamped around wrists, arms, waists. The Sabine women were being ripped from the crowd, pulled into the shadows of Rome with a force that no festival mask could hide. The music faltered. Then silence, thick and suffocating. A father lunged forward, his face twisted in rage, but a Roman blade met his chest before he could even cry out. He staggered, eyes wide, blood spilling onto the dirt, the scent of iron choking the air. And then chaos. The Sabine men fought, fists flying, knives flashing, but they had come unarmed, their trust their undoing. The Romans, prepared, ruthless, struck with a precision honed in desperation. Bodies hit the ground. More screams. A child wailed as his mother was torn from his grasp, her nails clawing at the earth, at anything, anyone. They did not just take women. They took futures. The Sabine women kicked, bit, shrieked, their voices piercing through the night. But Rome did not loosen its grip. It could not. A woman with braids woven in gold fought like a lion, her fists wild, her nails drawing blood from the face of the man who held her. He grunted, his lips split open, but he did not let go. Instead, he yanked her closer, breath hot against her ear as he muttered something low, something only she could hear. Her eyes flared with fury, her teeth bared like a wolf's, but her body stiffened. A threat. A promise. One by one, they were dragged away, their feet scraping against the dirt, leaving trails of torn silk and crushed flowers. Some still screamed. Others were silent, their minds already fleeing where their bodies could not. The festival fires flickered, casting long shadows over the ruined feast. The Sabine men, broken, bleeding, watched their daughters, their sisters, their wives vanish into the darkness of Rome. And the gates closed behind them. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Not from the weight of the earth shifting, not from the anger of the gods, but from the relentless march of vengeance. Thousands of Sabine warriors, their eyes dark with fury, their faces hardened by grief, surged forward, their weapons raised, their voices low with the promise of blood. The gates of Rome loomed ahead, thick and unyielding, but nothing felt impenetrable when hatred burned this fiercely. The stolen daughters, the shattered families, the betrayal carved into their souls, it all led here, to this moment. A single horn split the silence. And then, war. The first Sabine spear found its mark in the throat of a Roman sentry. He collapsed before he could scream, blood spraying against the stone walls, warm and thick. More spears flew, whistling through the air like the ghosts of the stolen women, crying out for vengeance. The Romans scrambled, their shouts colliding in the chaos, their swords drawn in a desperate clang of metal against metal. Bodies slammed into each other. Shields cracked. Bones shattered. The smell of sweat and iron, of rage and fear, filled the air. The Sabines fought like men possessed, their strikes wild but devastating, their pain a blade honed into something deadly. A Roman soldier caught the edge of a Sabine axe against his ribs, his mouth opening in a choked gasp as blood gushed down his tunic. He fell, but another took his place, sword flashing, carving through flesh. A Sabine warrior staggered, his arm nearly severed, yet he did not scream, he only bared his teeth and rammed his dagger into the Roman's gut. For hours, the battle raged, neither side willing to yield. The streets of Rome, once alive with celebration, now ran slick with blood. The cries of the dying rose to the heavens, mingling with the roars of the living, a song of war sung in a language older than words. And then, a voice cut through the carnage. A woman's voice. It came from the battlefield's heart, where the fallen lay, where the swords clashed the hardest. A Sabine woman, her hair wild, her eyes alight with something neither fear nor surrender, stepped forward. Behind her, more followed. The stolen daughters. The stolen wives. The ones torn from their homes, now standing between their fathers and their husbands. The world seemed to hold its breath. A Sabine warrior, his sword raised, froze as his daughter locked eyes with him, her face streaked with tears and war. A Roman, panting, bleeding, lowered his blade as his wife gripped his wrist, shaking her head. The battlefield, once filled with the sounds of slaughter, fell silent. No man moved. No man spoke. The war had been fought in their name. But they refused to let it end in ruin. The battlefield reeked of iron and death. Blood pooled in the cracks of the earth, staining the dirt where brothers, fathers, and husbands had fallen. The cries of the wounded blended with the clash of swords, the heavy breathing of men locked in the throes of slaughter. The war had reached its peak, neither side willing to bend, neither willing to bleed for nothing. Then, through the chaos, through the screaming and the fury, they stepped forward. Barefoot, their dresses torn from desperate hands grabbing for them, their hair tangled with dust and grief. Some still clutched the children they had borne to the very men their fathers sought to kill. Others walked empty-handed, their fingers curled into fists, their nails caked with the dirt of the homes they had been ripped from. The Sabine women. They did not hesitate. They did not wait for permission. They moved with the weight of something greater than fear, something heavier than love. A Sabine warrior, blood smeared across his cheek, raised his sword, its edge wet with Roman blood. His grip tightened. His fury had carried him through the slaughter, and it would not abandon him now. But then, she was there. His daughter. His own flesh and blood, standing between him and the Roman he was about to strike down. Her eyes, his eyes, held him in place. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling with something that was not fear but resolve. "Enough," she said. Her voice was not a plea. It was a command. The word cut through the battlefield sharper than any blade. More women moved between the carnage, their hands raised, their bodies forming an unbreakable wall of flesh and bone. They stood between fathers and husbands, between vengeance and duty, between love and war. A Roman soldier, his hands trembling, found himself face to face with the woman who had become his wife, the mother of his child. Her lips quivered, but her stance did not. "If you strike him," she whispered, "you strike me." The weight of it was unbearable. Fathers stood frozen, their arms shaking under the weight of their swords. They had come here to reclaim their daughters, but what did that mean now? These were not the same girls they had lost. They had changed. They had become something else, wives, mothers, lovers. Their blood was already mixed with Rome's. Their bodies had already chosen their loyalties. A Roman king stood at the heart of it all, his blade lowered, his breath ragged. Across from him, the Sabine leader, his chest rising and falling like a beast caged too long. And between them, the women. Tears streamed down some faces, but none of them faltered. They would not be moved. Somewhere in the distance, a man let his weapon slip from his fingers. The clang of metal on stone echoed through the battlefield. Another sword fell. And then another. The war did not end with a treaty. It did not end with a victor or a loser. It ended with women standing between the ruins of what was and what could no longer be. The silence was unbearable. The battlefield had gone still, but the scent of blood lingered, thick and metallic, clinging to the air as if refusing to be forgotten. Bodies, some breathing, some not, lay in twisted heaps, the earth greedily drinking in what their wounds had spilled. 1,000 eyes watched, wide and unblinking, filled with something far more dangerous than hatred. Hesitation. Then, the Sabine king moved. Step by step, slow and deliberate, he closed the distance between himself and Rome's ruler. The tension cracked like ice beneath a footstep, ready to give way to chaos at the slightest wrong move. Warriors gripped their weapons, torn between instinct and restraint, caught between the ghosts of their fallen and the women who had thrown themselves into the fray to stop the killing. The king stood face to face. Neither bowed. Neither looked away. The weight of an entire war settled between them, pressing into their bones, threatening to break them beneath its crushing inevitability. A woman stood between them. Her hands, bloodied from holding the wounded, were steady now. She did not speak, but she did not have to. Her presence was a blade against the throat of war. The Sabine king's lips parted. His voice, when it came, was raw. "This ends." The words did not belong to him alone. They belonged to the men who had fought, the women who had wept, the children who had no say in the fate being decided for them. They belonged to Rome. They belonged to the Sabines. And yet, the silence stretched, as if the earth itself demanded proof. Then, the Roman king extended his hand. A breath. A pause. A moment that would shape everything that came after. The Sabine king's fingers curled around his. It was not an embrace. It was not forgiveness. It was an agreement written in blood, sealed by loss, forged in the fire of a war neither side had truly won. A shudder ran through the gathered warriors. Some gritted their teeth, their hands tightening around weapons that had no more purpose. Others let out a breath they had not realized they were holding. The air shifted. Rome and the Sabines were no longer enemies. The dead had been left in the soil, but something else rose in their place. A new people. A new kingdom. A unity that would never be clean, never be easy, never be without its fractures. But it would be strong. It would last. And the blood-stained hands that had built it would never forget. The ground trembled beneath the weight of marching feet. Dust choked the air, rising in thick clouds as Rome's legions moved like a living beast, its armor glinting beneath the punishing sun. Shields locked, spears bristled, their formation perfect, unyielding. A heartbeat passed. Then another. The silence stretched so thin it felt like it would snap. And then, the roar. It was not the cry of men. It was something older, something raw and unforgiving, a sound that belonged to war itself. It swallowed the land, rolled over hills, shattered the fragile illusion of peace. Rome was coming. The enemy broke first. It always did. A man stumbled, the weight of his shield dragging him down as his foot slipped in the blood-soaked mud. He barely had time to raise his head before the tip of a Roman gladius found his throat. A sharp gasp. A strangled gurgle. Then nothing. Another enemy fell. And another. It did not matter how many stood against them. Rome was not just men. It was an idea, a force that could not be reasoned with, could not be bargained with. It crushed cities beneath its heel and called it progress. It burned villages and called it destiny. Flames licked at the sky in the distance, turning the horizon into a canvas of ruin. The cries of the fallen mingled with the crackling of timber and the desperate prayers of those who still clung to the illusion that mercy existed. But Rome did not know mercy. The battlefield was not enough. The city walls were not enough. The rivers, the mountains, the oceans, they were not enough. There was always more to take. More to conquer. More to claim in the name of a republic that would one day call itself an empire. A Roman commander stood at the edge of the carnage, his sword dripping, his breath steady. His gaze swept over the broken bodies, the smoking ruins, the shattered remnants of another city that had dared defy Rome. He lifted his hand. Behind him, the legion stood ready, waiting for the next command, the next conquest, the next war that would feed the insatiable hunger of a city that refused to stop growing. His fingers curled into a fist. The order was given. And Rome marched forward. The air inside the chamber was thick, the weight of what was about to happen pressing against the ribs of every man seated in the flickering torchlight. Shadows stretched across the stone walls, jagged and restless, like silent watchers bearing witness to the birth of something monstrous or magnificent. A single cough echoed, a man clearing his throat, steadying himself for the words that would shape Rome's future. The Senate was forming. and power had found its first willing hands. 50 men, then 100, their togas draped in careful folds, the fabric stiff with sweat, with fear, with the unspoken knowledge that the world beyond these walls was waiting. Watching. Expecting something that would last. But here, inside this sacred space, there were no gods. Only men. And men were dangerous. A voice cut through the murmurs, sharp, unyielding. One senator rose, his presence alone enough to command silence. His eyes burned with something unnameable, something ruthless. His words struck like a hammer against an anvil. Laws. Order. Control. A murmur. A ripple of shifting weight, of men glancing at one another, measuring, calculating. The words he spoke would be written in stone, etched into the backbone of a city that was not yet an empire but already pulsed with the hunger of one. The Republic, they would call it, but there was no softness in that name. Republic was a beast with iron jaws, held together by the will of the men who sat here now, their fingers twitching as they reached for the reins. Outside, Rome pulsed with life. Merchants argued in the streets, soldiers sharpened their blades, mothers whispered warnings to their sons. The people did not know what was unfolding within these walls, not yet. But soon, they would feel it. A fist slammed against wood. Agreement. A decision made. Laws took shape like blades being forged, red-hot, beaten into form, sharpened until they could cut the throat of anyone who dared oppose them. The 12 tables. The foundation of everything. Voices rose, clashed, collided like waves against rock. Some men fought for fairness, for balance. Others wove words into snares, ensuring power settled into the right hands, hands that already held the wealth, the influence, the ability to shape Rome like clay beneath their fingers. One man leaned forward, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet it cut through the noise like a dagger sliding between ribs. His words? A warning. What they built here would last centuries, but only if they fed it. Fed it with loyalty, with obedience, with blood if necessary. Silence. A final vote. And the Senate stood as one, their shadows thrown long against the walls, their hearts pounding in unison with the beating pulse of Rome. The sky above the battlefield was an unforgiving slate, thick with the stench of blood and burnt flesh. A wind howled through the valley, carrying the wails of the dying, the clash of steel, the hollow gasp of men realizing, too late, that their gods had abandoned them. And in the midst of it all, Romulus stood, his blade dripping, his eyes fixed on the broken enemy before him. The first king of Rome was not a man of mercy. He was a storm given flesh. The ground beneath his sandals was soaked, a slick mixture of mud and gore that threatened to swallow the weak. But Romulus did not stumble. He walked through the carnage as if it had been laid before him as an offering, the shattered bodies of his enemies paving his path to glory. The Sabines had come to crush Rome, to reclaim their stolen daughters, to remind the upstart city that it was nothing but a fragile dream of power. Now, their broken ranks sprawled across the hills, their shields shattered, their spirits splintered. A warrior lunged, wild-eyed, desperate, too slow. Romulus moved like a shadow, sidestepping the clumsy strike and burying his sword hilt deep into the man's gut. A strangled gasp, a hand grasping at empty air, then silence. He yanked his blade free, not bothering to watch the body crumple to the earth. There were more. There were always more. Behind him, the banner of Rome snapped in the wind, the crimson fabric stiff with dried blood. The men who followed him, his wolves, had fought with a fury that would be spoken of for generations. They were not soldiers. They were conquerors. And under Romulus, Rome did not beg, did not barter. It took. His wars were not won by strategy alone. They were won by the fire in his bones, the sheer unrelenting force of his will. When the neighboring cities mocked his fledgling kingdom, he marched upon them, left their walls crumbling, their rulers kneeling. When treachery lurked within his own city, he rooted it out, his justice swift, merciless, unquestioned. Rome did not share power. Rome consumed. And yet, it was not enough. The hunger inside him was insatiable, gnawing at him with each victory, each expansion, each conquest. The gods had given him this city, torn from the bones of an empire not yet born, and he would see it rise, or he would see it burn. His enemies called him a tyrant. His people called him a king. But Romulus? He knew what he truly was. He was Rome. And Rome would never kneel. The sky cracked open like a wound in the heavens. The air pulsed with an unnatural charge, thick and stifling, pressing down upon the gathering like an unseen hand. Every man in the crowd felt it, something was wrong. The sun, once bright and unchallenged, had vanished behind an unnatural blackness, a storm that had come without warning. And in the center of it all, Romulus stood tall, his crimson cloak whipping in the howling winds. A moment before, there had been voices, shouts, murmurs, the raw hum of power that always followed the king. Senators, warriors, and citizens had surrounded him atop the Palatine Hill, their faces upturned in reverence, in fear, in awe. He had been speaking, his voice like iron, hammering edicts into the bones of Rome itself. But then, something changed. The air itself seemed to recoil, the wind twisting in unnatural patterns, a whisper slithering through the crowd, unseen yet felt by all. The first lightning bolt struck so close that the earth trembled beneath their feet. A collective gasp rippled through the masses, but Romulus did not flinch. His eyes lifted to the sky, and in them burned something unreadable, something ancient, as if he had been expecting this. Another crack of light, violent and blinding, split the heavens. A moment later, the deafening roar of thunder drowned every sound. And then, silence. The world stood still. The wind died in an instant. The heavy press of the storm held its breath, as if nature itself was waiting. Romulus turned his gaze back to his people. His expression was unreadable, calm, almost knowing. He raised a hand, but before he could speak, before any man could move, the final bolt struck. The sky ripped apart. The light consumed everything, a monstrous brilliance that seared itself into their eyes, burning their souls with its fury. The air itself seemed to ignite, a roaring inferno of white fire, swallowing Romulus whole. And then, nothing. When the blindness faded, when their senses clawed their way back from the abyss, the people searched for him. Their king. Their god made flesh. But he was gone. The wind returned with a vengeance, shrieking through the city like a beast unchained. Some men fell to their knees, wailing in terror. Others stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Had the gods taken him? Had they punished him? Or had Romulus, son of Mars, ascended beyond mortal flesh? The senators whispered amongst themselves, fear laced in every breath. The soldiers, men who had seen war, blood, and death, gripped their weapons as if steel could protect them from something they could not name. The people of Rome would tell the tale for generations, that Romulus did not die, that he did not fall like an ordinary king. No body was found. No remains. No trace of where he had stood moments before. Only the storm remained. And its howling did not fade until the night swallowed Rome whole. The whispers began before the storm had even faded. Some swore they had seen it, an outline in the searing light, a figure lifted by forces not of this world. Others spoke of a voice, not thunder, but something deeper, a command etched into the marrow of their bones. Romulus was gone, but his presence lingered, thick and inescapable, like the air before a coming fire. The city held its breath. Days passed. No body. No sign of their king. And yet, the people still felt his gaze, as if he had never left. Soldiers sharpened their swords with empty stares, hands steady but hearts restless. Senators argued in hushed, urgent voices, the weight of an invisible presence pressing down upon them. The streets were filled with murmurs, with dread, with something that sat between awe and terror. Then, the old man came forward. Stiff with age but steady in his resolve, Proculus Julius stood before the assembled masses, his face carved with something that no mere words could express. His voice, though cracked by time, carried across the crowd, through the alleys, into the homes of those too afraid to leave. Romulus was not dead. The words hit like a hammer. He had not vanished into nothingness. He had not fallen prey to fate or treachery. The gods had taken him, not as punishment, not as loss, but as ascension. The heavens had opened to claim him. The people shuddered, not in doubt, but in certainty. It was not impossible. This was Romulus, the child of Mars, the one who had carved a kingdom from the dirt and made the wolves howl in obedience. If any man could rip himself free from mortal chains, it was him. A fever spread through Rome, hotter than the sun, heavier than war drums. The citizens spoke his name not in grief, but in reverence. There were those who fell to their knees in the streets, hands clutching at the air, as if they could still reach him. Others stared at the heavens, waiting, waiting, waiting. Then, the signs came. A wolf seen prowling the Capitoline, untouched by fear, its yellow eyes gleaming with something unnatural. A sudden wind sweeping through the forum, carrying with it the scent of blood and iron. The sky at dusk, streaked with an unearthly red, as if the sun itself had bowed to a new master. The gods had not simply taken him. They had crowned him. Romulus was no longer king. He was no longer bound by the weight of flesh. He had transcended, burned away the weakness of mortality. And in his place, in his glory, stood something else. Quirinus. The name spread like wildfire, searing itself into the tongues of every Roman. Not lost, not dead, reborn. The storm had not swallowed him. It had freed him. And Rome, his Rome, would never be the same. The silence before a storm is never truly empty. It hums. It watches. It waits. So, too, does the past. The story of Romulus stands at the edge of two worlds. On one side, a god-born king, a child raised by wolves, a warrior who bled the earth until a city rose from its bones. On the other, a man of flesh and fury, his hand stained not by divinity, but by the weight of conquest, of betrayal, of power clawed from chaos. The gods whisper one tale. The historians write another. Which one is real? Ask the old men who sit by the fire, their lips cracked with age, their voices thick with reverence. They will tell you of omens, of Mars bending fate itself to place his son among mortals. They will speak of signs in the sky, of Romulus chosen before birth, of the she-wolf's milk running thick with destiny. Ask the scholars, those who carve truth into brittle pages, who measure stories against the weight of logic. They will tell you of tribes and warlords, of rival factions clashing, of a city built not by the hands of gods, but by men desperate to stake their claim before the earth swallowed them whole. Ask the soldiers, the ones who still dream of battle long after the blood has dried from their swords. They will tell you Romulus was no legend, no myth wrapped in divine prophecy. He was a warlord, a ruler whose victories were paid for in the cries of the conquered. The gods did not raise Rome. Steel did. Yet the line between myth and history is not a clean cut. It is jagged, torn, shifting beneath the weight of centuries. One truth stands, undeniable. Rome rose. But was it lifted by hands, or by fate? The legends do not speak of doubt, of fear, of the blood that sticks even after the water runs clear. But history does. History whispers of a brother murdered, of a throne won not by right, but by ruthlessness. It tells of alliances built on shaking ground, of enemies watching, waiting, of a king whose rule was as fragile as the men who bowed before him. And yet, when the storm came, when the sky swallowed him whole, when his name left the lips of mortals and rose to the heavens, who dared deny the gods had taken him? Who could stand beneath that roaring sky and claim that history had not bled into legend? Who could look at Rome, unyielding, eternal, and swear that Romulus had been just a man? The past is never silent. It hums. It watches. It waits. And the truth, whatever it may be, will never let go. The earth trembled beneath his footsteps. Not in myth. Not in legend. In truth. In the hearts of men who followed him, in the hands that built the walls of his city, in the steel that carved Rome into existence. Romulus did not ask for Rome. He willed it. And what he willed, the world could not deny. The wolves had marked him long before men did. He was born in exile, raised in hunger, forged in the fire of a world that had no mercy for the weak. No man, no god, no force of nature could claim his fate. He had torn it from the jaws of oblivion with his own hands. That was Rome. That was its heartbeat. Unyielding. Ruthless. A city that did not bow, did not break, did not hesitate. He shaped it in his image. The blood on his hands became the blood in its streets. The ambition in his bones became the fire in its soul. The hunger in his heart, insatiable, merciless, became the hunger of an empire that would stretch its fingers across the world and never, never be satisfied. Conquest was not a choice. It was necessity. A Rome that did not expand, that did not devour, that did not burn its enemies to ash, was no Rome at all. He made war sacred. He made violence divine. The gods themselves had blessed him, lifted him, pulled him from the storm to take his place among them. And so, Rome marched with their favor, its soldiers believing not in the chance of victory, but in the certainty of it. If Romulus had ascended, if he had become something greater than mortal flesh, then Rome itself was not merely a city. It was destiny. Its laws bore his voice. Its order was his will, a discipline forged in battle, in survival, in the absolute refusal to be anything less than unstoppable. To be Roman was to obey, to stand firm, to never falter. The weak had no place within its gates. Mercy was not virtue. Hesitation was death. But Rome was more than war. It was unity. It was strength bound by loyalty, by duty, by something that pulsed in the veins of every citizen. The people did not just serve Rome. They were Rome. Their blood, their sacrifice, their unwavering belief, these were the stones in its foundation, the iron in its gates, the breath in its lungs. Romulus had not merely built a city. He had carved an identity into the bones of civilization itself. The world would bend before it. Or it would burn. The flames crackled in the darkness, shadows writhing against the stone like spirits restless in their confinement. Smoke curled upward, thick and heavy, it sent mingling with the iron tang of blood, the sweat of supplicants, the murmured chants that trembled on their tongues. The fire was never allowed to die. To let it wane was to invite ruin. Somewhere beyond the sacred space, Rome pulsed, alive with the breath of thousands who owed their existence to two figures, one mortal, one divine, both eternal. Romulus and Remus. Founders. Brothers. Gods. The city had been born from violence, baptized in betrayal, sealed with the blood of one twin spilling into the earth. That wound never closed. It lived in the whispered prayers of those who knelt before the altars, in the frantic desperation of soldiers begging for victory, in the trembling hands of mothers who clutched their children and swore oaths to the gods of Rome. The twins had risen beyond flesh, beyond time, beyond history. Their spirits never left the city they had carved from nothing. Romulus ascended, crowned in divinity as Quirinus. Remus, unavenged, his shadow lingering where his bones had once rested. One was worshipped in triumph. The other, in sorrow. The rituals were older than memory, woven into the very fabric of Rome's existence. The Lupercalia, the wild, frenzied rite that sent half-naked men sprinting through the streets, lashes in hand, striking those they passed to grant them fertility, strength, life. It was no simple festival. It was a reminder. A tribute to the wolf that had suckled the abandoned twins, to the savage hunger that had shaped them, to the beast that still lived within Rome's heart. Blood was always part of the offering. The priests of Quirinus draped themselves in the symbols of power, their hands steady as they lifted their voices to the heavens, calling to the god who had once been a man, the warrior who had become something more. They spoke his name in reverence, in fear, in unshakable certainty. He was with them. Always. But there were those who whispered of Remus in the dark. His altars were hidden, tucked away in corners where the forgotten gathered, where Rome's unworthy, the lost, the broken, still remembered the twin who had been struck down. Some believed his spirit lingered, not as a god, but as something else, something restless, something watching. The city lived in the tension between them, between Romulus triumphant and Remus forgotten, between the shining glory of the empire and the ghost that trailed behind it. Every citizen bore that weight. Every sacrifice, every oath, every drop of blood spilled on Rome's streets was another verse in the story that had begun with two brothers and would never, never end. The wind howled through the ruins, rattling the broken bones of an empire long turned to dust. Marble columns stood fractured, their once proud forms worn by centuries of storms, war, and the slow, relentless creep of time. And yet, even as the world shifted and crumbled, their story refused to die. It clung to the air, whispered in the echoes of footsteps along the shattered stone, waiting, always waiting, to be spoken again. Romulus and Remus. Their names had been carved into the soul of Rome, into its walls, its people, its fate. The twin sons of a forgotten god and a doomed mother, raised not by man but by the wild itself. They had risen from abandonment, from hunger, from the merciless hands of destiny, to claim a throne that did not yet exist. And when the moment of choice came, when the gods demanded a price for greatness, blood stained the soil. A brother's death. A city's birth. The foundation of an empire built on sacrifice. Centuries passed, but the legend burned on. It bled into statues of stone, into frescoes painted with trembling hands, into the minds of emperors who saw their own faces reflected in Romulus' triumph, their enemies in Remus' fall. They wielded the myth like a weapon, forging it into the armor of their rule. Rome was eternal, they swore, because its very beginning had been touched by divinity, by the unyielding will of its first king. But stories have a way of twisting in the hands of those who tell them. In the dark corners of the empire, in the places where the forgotten gathered, there were whispers that asked if Rome had ever truly been born, or if it had been cursed from the moment the first drop of blood hit the earth. Remus had died beneath his brother's hands, and Rome had risen, but was it a blessing or a wound that never healed? The city burned, and still, the tale endured. Invaders stormed its gates, barbarians clawed at its golden streets, and the empire that had once ruled the world crumbled beneath its own weight. But even as the great walls fell, even as the last breath of Rome seemed ready to fade into silence, the twins remained. Their story was too powerful to die. It did not belong to the stones of the city, nor to the men who had wielded it like a crown. It belonged to time itself. And time carried it forward. The Middle Ages whispered their names in hushed reverence, as monks scratched their story onto parchment by candlelight, preserving it even as Rome's grandeur rotted away. The Renaissance pulled them from the shadows, painting them in the glow of rebirth, sculpting their figures into works of art so lifelike it seemed they might breathe again. And the modern world, the world of steel and glass, of machines and quiet desperation, still speaks of them, still remembers. Romulus stands, triumphant, in the heart of every ruler who claims a throne with blood-stained hands. Remus lingers in the silence, in the doubt, in the question that will never be answered. What if things had been different? What if the gods had chosen another fate? But they did not. And so the story lives on, pulsing beneath the surface of history, waiting for the next voice to bring it back to life. The air is thick with the scent of rain-soaked stone, the lingering echo of footsteps swallowed by the vastness of the ancient streets. The ruins of a fallen empire stand silent, their marble faces scarred by centuries, but there is something more, something unseen, something alive. It lingers in the wind, in the cracks of the Colosseum, in the shadows stretching long across the Forum. Rome does not die. It waits. It endures. It watches. The prophecy had whispered of a city without end, a kingdom forged in blood and fate, a dominion that even the gods themselves would acknowledge. Romulus had taken his throne upon the body of his brother, his rule baptized in the first sacrifice. And the city rose, brick by brick, decree by decree, war by war, until its name became something more than mere geography. Rome was not just a place. It was an idea. It was power and ambition sculpted into flesh and stone, a heartbeat that refused to still. Legions marched, their sandals striking the earth like the pounding of war drums. They carved roads through mountains, through forests, through the bones of the conquered. Cities fell before them, their kings kneeling in chains or left to rot beneath burning skies. Rome stretched its fingers across the world, and with each victory, the prophecy rang louder. The eternal city. The unbreakable. The unconquered. But eternity is a cruel promise. The same gods who had smiled upon Rome turned their faces when the city demanded too much. The streets ran slick with blood, not of enemies, but of Romans themselves. Daggers found their way between ribs in marble halls, betrayal whispered in the corridors of power, emperors crowned and murdered in the span of a single breath. The people who had once cheered as gladiators clashed beneath the gaze of the gods, now watched as their own empire consumed itself. Fires swallowed its temples. Invaders breached its walls. The great bronze doors of the Senate stood ajar, the silence within deafening. Rome had been promised eternity, but eternity did not mean mercy. The city that had once dictated the fate of the world now stood fractured, its empire shattered, its dominion crumbling into the dust it had once risen from. And yet, Rome did not end. Even in ruin, its spirit did not fade. Its laws, its language, its gods, its ambition, they bled into the veins of those who came after, shaping kingdoms, building nations, whispering into the ears of emperors who had never set foot upon its soil. Rome was not just a city. It was a ghost, a hunger, an unrelenting force that wove itself into history, refusing to be buried. The eternal city had been prophesied. And prophecy is never wrong.